One of the major reform movements of the antebellum period, the time preceding the Civil War, was the women's rights movement. Now, generally people think of that as a suffrage movement, which it is, gaining women the right to vote, which eventually will happen with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But the women's rights movement was more than just suffrage. Initially, the women's rights movement works hand in hand with the abolitionist movement. There will be a non-amicable split in that movement sometime in the period just before the Civil War. By far the most important meeting or most important event in the women's rights was Seneca Falls. In 1848, leaders of the women's rights movement, now known as the suffragists, met in Seneca Falls, New York at the Seneca Falls Convention. On the left, you see a portrayal of Elizabeth Cady Stanton speaking at the women's rights movement, and on the right, you see a tourist picture from today, but where it shows women getting together and meeting in historic Seneca Falls. What Seneca Falls does is to lay the groundwork for what will become the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement, and they do so by paralleling the structure of the Declaration of Independence. At Seneca Falls, women demand several things: better education, property rights, which exist only in a very small number of states, meaning that at that time women existed as femme couvert. Femme meaning woman, couvert covered, meaning that when they became married, their legal rights were covered by those of their husband. So a woman could be very, very wealthy, and the day she was married, all of her wealth became that of her husband. If he had a child by another marriage, say a son, and he died the first day that the woman was married, none of the wealth that she brought to the marriage went back to her. That is, it would all go to his son. Women also wanted a change in custody laws, and of course they pushed very hard for suffrage rights. Choosing New York for the meeting, Seneca Falls, New York, was certainly not a random event. Remember that New York is important in other reform movements. For example, the religious reform movements, the Second Great Awakening. There were so many fire and brimstone preachers going throughout New York that a large part of it became known as the Burned Over District. So it is a hotbed of reform in many areas, both in religion and in women's rights and women's suffrage. Additionally, in the mid-late 1840s, the New York legislature became a leading state in the United States, passing a statute allowing women to keep property rights while married. As advertised, Seneca Falls was a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and the rights of women. Two of the leaders at the Seneca Falls movement were Lucretia Mott on the right and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left. Lucretia Mott, of course, was a Quaker. Quakers were prominent in many of these movements because the Quaker theology is a very egalitarian theology, believing in the equality of all people. So it just made sense for Quakers to be involved in women's rights or in suffrage. The following are now our excerpts from the Seneca Falls Declaration, written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And again, Stanton wrote the language to parallel the key phrases of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the Declaration was signed in July 4th, 1776, at least proclaimed at that time, by the Second Continental Congress. So the Seneca Falls Declaration begins: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, not among men, just instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Continuing the parallel structure with the Declaration of Independence, the Seneca Falls Declaration continues: "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He is taken from all right and property, even the wages she earns. In the covenant of marriage she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming, to all intents and purposes, her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. Those who were against women gaining any type of equality, suffrage, or equality of any type, portrayed cartoons to show just how wrong this would be. Here is a cartoon saying, oh my, if women had equal rights, look, they would be driving carriages. They would be going off to work. Men would be at home watching the baby, cleaning clothes on a washboard, and sewing, with the suggestion that that would be wrong. By the mid to late 19th century, past the antebellum period and following the Civil War, Susan B. Anthony will become a leader in what will become the suffrage movement and women's rights movement. Susan B. Anthony also has a background of being a Quaker, thus an egalitarian-leaning theology and personal philosophy. Anthony will, very famously, be arrested for attempting to vote in 1872, which will be another one of the very important actions in the suffrage movement. Remember Seneca Falls, 1848, Anthony arrested 1872. The 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, not ratified until 1920. And of course, going back to the founding of the time periods, we cannot forget, even though they were not published at the time, Abigail Adams' letters to her husband saying, remember the ladies, give us some rights in this new republic which you are creating. So here are some mid to late 19th century thoughts by the great suffragist Susan B. Anthony on marriage and slavery. The married woman and their legal status. What is servitude? The condition of a slave. What is a slave? A person who is robbed of the proceeds of his labor, a person who is subject to the will of another. I submit. The deprivation by law of ownership of one's own person, wages, property, children, the denial of right as an individual to sue and be sued, to vote and to testify in the courts is a condition of servitude most bitter and absolute, though under the sacred name of marriage. Thus, the antebellum period is exceptionally important in the beginning of a strong suffrage movement, although it will take almost 3/4 of a century to be successful, and the beginning of a women's rights movement. The early suffragists at Seneca Falls in 1848 included Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and were, again, although 3/4 of a century later, they were very important in creating the 19th Amendment, the ratifying of the 19th Amendment that gives women the right to vote in 1920.